Hello, this is the Branches of Government, Section B, Executive Branch Lecture. Our prioritized standard is Government Civics 9, and objectively, we're going to analyze the executive branch of the national government. There is a presidential election in years divisible by 4, or in other words, every leap year, on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, where presidential electors are chosen with the duty of choosing a president and a vice president. So if you didn't know, our current president is Orange Fury Donald Trump, Republican from New York. Quick tour of the White House. Here's the White House when you're on 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And if you go behind on the other opposite end, that's what it looks like. Here's what it looks like up there. If you notice this little oval area, right below it is the Oval Office. Ooh. So, see, magic. And that shows you the West Wing, which West Wing, where most of the business actually takes place, which is on this side. All right. The president serves a 4-year term. May only serve 2 full terms, and may not serve more than 10 years in office. This is according to the 22nd Amendment. So technically, you can serve more than 8 years, but you can only serve 2 full terms. So if you were a vice president filling in, you could actually serve longer than just 8 years. Hasn't been done since they passed it, but nonetheless. All right. Fun story about that. Generally speaking, President George Washington, he begrudgingly served a term, and then he only begrudgingly served a second term, and then after 2 terms, he said, I'm done. And basically every president has said, okay, 2 terms was good enough for George Washington, so that's good enough for me, until Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected 4 times to be president. And then right after that, the Republican Congress determined we can never have this ever happen again. They passed an amendment that basically said, okay, no more than 2 terms. President must be a natural born citizen, which generally means you have to be born here. At least 35 years old, because you're so mature at 35. Speaking of old, even though 35 is the minimum age, the youngest we've ever had is actually Theodore Roosevelt, who was 42. And our oldest president is our current president, Donald Trump, who was 70 when he became president. Also, they have to have lived in the U.S. for at least 14 years. 20th Amendment actually made these requirements the same for the vice president. The president and the vice president is actually sworn in at noon on January the 20th following the presidential election. The vice president assumes the presidency in the event that he or she is unable to serve due to either death, resignation, or possibly removal from office. The order of presidential succession beyond the vice president is fixed by the Presidential Succession Act of 1947. So this little graphic here shows you, hey, who's up after Mike Pence. The 25th Amendment also allowed the vice president to become the acting president in the event of a presidential disability. This can happen if the president in writing informs Congress that he or she is unable to perform his or her duties. This can also happen if the vice president and a majority of the members of the cabinet deem the president unable to perform his or her duties. Now, if the president is deemed to have a disability, he or she may resume his or her presidential powers and duties by informing Congress that no inability still exists. So, if there is some question as to for instance, if there's a challenge about the president not having an inability, 2/3 majority of Congress may actually deem the president unable to resume the presidency, which therefore keeps the vice president as the acting president. But again, that needs 2/3 majority of both houses to actually do that. The president is responsible for executing, meaning enforcing, administering, and carrying out the provisions of federal laws, although the president does have some discretion into how vigorously certain laws are actually applied. The president has the power to appoint top-ranking officers to the federal government that aid the president in executing the law with what's considered Senate advice and consent, meaning you have to have a majority of the Senate agree. Positions include cabinet members, diplomats or ambassadors, heads of independent agencies, all federal judges, U.S. Marshals, federal attorneys, and high-ranking officers in the armed forces. Also, the president has the power to remove executive branch government officials with the exception of the vice president. And federal judges he can't actually remove, but they're not actually executive, so yeah. While Congress is responsible for creating federal laws, the president has the power to issue what are called executive orders, which are directives, rules, or regulations that have the effect of law. So it's kind of like a law, except you don't have to have that pesky Congress in the way. Also, the president has several diplomatic and military powers, which together give the president much power in foreign relations. The president, which usually acts through the Secretary of the State, negotiates treaties with foreign nations, can make executive agreements, and exercises the power of recognition over foreign affairs. Again, a treaty, this is a formal agreement between two or more sovereign nations. For a treaty, you have to have 2/3 majority vote in the Senate for it to actually become effective. Executive agreements, instead, this is a pact between the president and the head of a foreign state. This does not actually require any Senate consent for this one. And also the power of recognition. This is formal acknowledgement of a government as legitimate by either receiving or denying diplomats. So by recognizing a country, this basically means the U.S. acknowledges the legal existence of a country and its government. While Congress declares war, the president has much power in his capacity as the commander-in-chief of the nation's armed forces. The president always has final authority over and responsibility for all military matters. The president may conduct undeclared wars without congressional approval, yet only for a very short period of time. There's, generally speaking, a 60-day limit for the use of troops without congressional approval. The Constitution gave the president non-executive powers, which often serve as checks against the other branches of the government. For instance, the president has legislative powers that give him influence over the legislative process. For instance, the president can recommend legislation to Congress. This is usually done in the State of the Union address. Also, the power to veto legislation is seldom overridden by Congress. So if we take a look at this, most of the time when a president vetoes, it is not overridden. So grand total 2,572 total vetoes. Only 110 times have they been overridden. So that's about a 4% success rate in overriding a presidential veto, which is not very good. Also, the president may call special sessions of Congress. This is usually reserved for national emergencies, but may be called for less urgent reasons at the president's discretion. So there is an example of one of those. And the president can also make recess appointments to temporarily fill vacancies. Yet for that to remain in effect, the Senate does have to approve the recess appointment by the end of the next session of Congress. If not, then another one has to be put in. Also, the executive branch breaks ties in the Senate through the vice president that serves as the president of the Senate. In addition to the power to appoint federal judges, the president has judicial powers allowing for what's called clemency, or mercy or leniency involving federal offenses, but not state offenses. So if you commit a state crime, better be buddies with the governor. In the form of reprieves, which is postponement of the execution of a sentence, which also includes an ability to commute sentences or the reduction of the length of a sentence that was imposed by court. And also pardons, which is legal forgiveness for a crime. So here's an example of Richard Nixon's pardon that he got from Gerald Ford, pardoning him for all of his illegal actions during Watergate. Pardoning power includes the ability to grant what's called amnesty, which is a blanket pardon that's offered to a group of law violators. All right, this concludes the branches of government, Section B, Executive Branch lecture. We hit Government Civic Standard 9, and objectively now you can analyze the executive branch of the national government.